Coalition. Hi, everyone. Welcome, and thank you for joining us for today's special presentation on the Northwest Forest Plan. First, I want to welcome everyone from outside the Power Nature Coalition who is attending today. Power Nature is a statewide coalition of over 100 different community groups, tribal and environmental organizations, land trusts, and other NGOs, all dedicated to furthering 30 by 30 in California. My name is Josefina, and I'm part of the coalition's team, and I help lead the Far Northern Regional Group of the coalition. We have 7 different regional groups as well as topical groups in our coalition. If you have not already joined, I can put the info for our website and sign up form in the chat. That way you can do so at your leisure. So for today's webinar, we have the honor of hosting 3 different environmental organizations, EPIC, the American Bird Conservancy, and CalWild, and their experts. I'll pass it off to Tom to introduce himself.
Hi all, my name is Tom Wheeler. I'm the Executive Director of EPIC. I'm also an attorney. I've been here since 2014, so coming on 10 years, which is almost unbelievable to me. Now I'll pass it over to Steve Holmer.
Great, thanks, Tom. Steve Holmer, Vice President of Policy with American Bird Conservancy. I'm out here in Washington, D.C.
Hi, this is Ryan Henson. I'm the Policy Director with CalWild, and I think I know about half of you looking at the names. But I work statewide, but I just wanted to note that for today's discussion, I actually cut my teeth as a volunteer working on Mendocino County's ancient forests, specifically my beloved Mendocino National Forest, which that was in 1987 I got started. And then you can imagine the Northwest Forest Plan of 1994 was a real game changer. So I'll just offer that background. Thank you.
Thanks, Ryan. Tom, are you good to kick us off with talking about the Northwest Forest Plan history and success?
Sure. So in some ways, it's funny for me to talk about the Northwest Forest Plan history because I was only 7 when the Northwest Forest Plan was passed. And I imagine Steve and Ryan were both combatants in the timber wars and worked on the Northwest Forest Plan when it first passed some 30 odd years ago. The Northwest Forest Plan was designed to be a 100-year plan. It is kind of a first of its kind, a plan for ecological management of a region that wasn't constrained by political boundaries. So this covered both Forest Service and Bureau of Land Management lands across the range of the northern spotted owl. And it was very much in response to the northern spotted owl. The listing of the northern spotted owl in 1990 had pretty dramatic effects on forest management and litigation to protect the northern spotted owl because of its listing had pretty dramatic effects on forest management across the Pacific Northwest. And because of this this kind of stalemate that occurred over forest management, over logging, I'll stop using the euphemistic term, the Clinton administration convened a panel of scientists. The scientists put forward a number of options for potential conservation of the Pacific Northwest. Ultimately, Clinton chose kind of the least protective of the plan's alternative 9. Yet still, I think that we are now 30 years into this 100-year plan, enjoying great results as a result of the Northwest Forest Plan. So the problem of 1990 of the spotted owl's listing was the decline of mature and old growth trees in the Pacific Northwest, which the northern spotted owl, marble murrelet, and other endangered species were reliant upon. As a result of the Northwest Forest Plan, the loss of older forests has largely flatlined. And if we take out anthropogenic losses on federal lands, we will actually have seen a net recruitment of these forests. It's been supremely successful in protecting that northern spotted owl forest. Same too with marble murrelet. We are seeing an increase in the total number of acres available for marble murrelets since the plan passed 30 years ago because trees are aging and becoming available for their use. It's had other great impacts as well. We've seen a reduction in road miles because of road removal. We've seen an increase in canopy closure. We've seen a drive of investment for watershed restoration. We've seen a reduction of areas of high landslide risk that have roads. So in effect, it's working. The one area in which I think folks might take issue with that statement is, are we meeting what was then determined to be the probable sale quantity in the Pacific Northwest? So this was the amount that the Clinton administration, in passing the Northwest Forest Plan, had anticipated would be the amount of timber that could come off of these lands. And we haven't, and there are a good number of reasons why. I think foremost among them is that the Clinton administration overestimated the amount of potential logging that could occur under the Northwest Forest Plan. So you'll often hear rural communities talk about this broken promise of the Northwest Forest Plan. I don't think that it was ever a good promise made by the Clinton administration. The Northwest Forest Plan has also helped in trying to diversify the economies of these once timber-dependent rural communities. We've seen a real growth in recreation and other non-consumptive jobs in our national forests. So this is something that is encouraging as well. I think the Northwest Forest Plan has been a success. And so as an environmental leader in the Pacific Northwest, I'm concerned because we are now entering into potential amendments of the Northwest Forest Plan. And these could see a weakening of the Northwest Forest Plan, particularly, I think, in the dry forests of Northern California and Southern Oregon, where EPIC does our work, as well as some of the eastern forests of Eastern Oregon and Eastern Washington, all of which could see new amendments that would enhance the ability of the Forest Service to offer timber sales in areas that once had been off limits. So I'll end it there. And I hope that that was a good kind of broad overview of the Northwest Forest Plan.
Thanks, Tom. Steve, are you ready to take it away on the amendment process?
Sure, happy to. I will share my screen here. And is that looking good?
Yep, looks great.
Okay, great. Well, just to introduce myself a little bit more. I got started on this issue lobbying in support of the Ancient Forest Protection Act back in 1990. And then I was with the Western Ancient Forest Campaign and then American Lands Alliance all during the 90s as the plan was being implemented and often attacked. And I think a lot of times people wonder, how in the world did we get such amount of protection in the first place? And the short story is that a federal judge shut down the federal timber sale program across the region. And that seems like a pretty dramatic action. But in fact, the judge had found out that the Forest Service had violated the laws in terms of carrying out the timber sale program. In fact, because of some Forest Service documents, we knew that the forest not only was being overcut and that there was severe harm happening as a result, but the agency knew this and that they were taking steps to kind of skirt around it. And so Judge Dwyer really threw the book at him and shut down the whole program. And so the hope then was that we would pass permanent legislation to protect the ancient forests. And we had legislation in the Congress, in the House and Senate. And we actually got it to a point, thanks to the huge amount of public engagement, that these bills had the votes to pass. And we had gotten it through the biggest hurdle, which was the House Agriculture Committee. It had marked up there and was headed to the Natural Resources Committee, where we thought for sure it was going to get improved. And instead, Speaker of the House Thomas Foley intervened and canceled the markup and said that under no circumstances would the Ancient Forest Bill ever get a vote in the House. And so that effectively killed the legislative effort. And so then that sort of left it to the Clinton administration to deal with a range-wide injunction, the shutdown of the timber sale program, and coming up with a legally defensible plan that could help recover species. And, and when we look at this now, it's important to look at the big picture, which is that we have a dual biodiversity and climate crisis. And the Northwest Forest Plan is one of those rare solutions that helps us on both. And when we look at what the plan was about, it was really focused on the recovery of the northern spotted owl, the marbled murrelet, as well as quite a few salmon stocks. And a lot of the elements, protective elements in the plan were specifically designed to help recover these populations. The map on the left shows the whole area of the range of the northern spotted owl. And so that's roughly what the plan covers. And since the plan started in 1994, there's been monitoring reports that show that the habitat restoration is working, that in fact we're growing back forests, and that we've reduced the cutting of old forest, which also releases a tremendous amount of carbon. And so we really have a rare climate change success story because we've reversed the carbon flow in this region. We're now storing carbon where it used to be lost as a result of old growth logging. So when we look at the past recent history of updating the Northwest Forest Plan, during the Obama administration, there was some very initial steps taken to possibly update the plan. This accelerated during the Trump administration, where we saw a series of products put out, and I'd have to say I raised big flags about this era. The Trump administration put tremendous pressure on the Forest Service to quadruple logging levels from 2.5 billion to 10 billion board feet, and also pressured the Fish and Wildlife Service to eliminate protections for the spotted owl in order to help facilitate that. And so we saw a number of products come out from both the Fish and Wildlife Service and the Forest Service during this period that I think that bear very close scrutiny because of the tremendous political pressure that they were being put under to increase logging. This may be culminated with the spotted owl critical habitat rule that came out in 2021 at the end of the Trump administration that would have exempted 3.4 million acres of northern spotted owl critical habitat in its most important core range. Scientists called me up to say that this actually was an extinction plan for the owl. And this is something that the Fish and Wildlife Service put into effect as a final rule just a couple of years ago. So it gives an idea of just how strong this pressure was. So when we look at the amendment that the Forest Service has rolled out in the process, they've identified a series of issues that are going to be the main basis for this particular amendment. And it's important to understand that an amendment is not a complete plan revision. They're not looking at the entire plan. They're just looking at a subset of issues that they think need to be updated and would be handled by this amendment. And so these are the kind of the big buckets that they have included for this. And I was concerned when I saw this because it did not include recovery of endangered species or climate mitigation, the carbon storage element. So I felt like it was sort of a little bit of a slanted, incomplete list. And now as the process has gone on further, and I've attended some of the meetings, I'd have to say I'm very concerned by how the Forest Service has framed this primarily as a response to the wildfire crisis and the need to change the plan to deal with fire issues. They have convened a federal advisory committee. They're pretty close to done with their process. They voted on their draft recommendations, and I'm assuming that we're going to see the final recommendations coming out very soon. And I also assume that is going to be the basis for the preferred alternative in the plan amendment is those federal advisory committee recommendations. So I think that they bear some close scrutiny, and I think that it's going to be a mixed bag. I think we may see some added protection, but we may see some things that concern us. I also just quickly mentioned there's a second process underway, the president's executive order for old growth forests. It's currently in the public comment period. This could provide an overlay of added protection for the old forests in the Pacific Northwest. Comments are due on that plan on the 20th. And so when I look at the big changes that have happened since the plan went into effect, the biggest single one was the 2012 Northern Spotted Owl Critical Habitat Rule. It had the effect of protecting high quality spotted owl habitat in the matrix. The matrix are the areas that the plan had intended to allow for logging. But because the critical habitat rule protects some of that, it fundamentally changes the plan. It affected approximately 40% of the matrix, so not an insignificant amount. but I don't really feel like the agency ever fully responded to it. They didn't change the probable sale quantity, even though a lot of those old forests that they'd planned to log that were going to provide most of the volume simply weren't going to be available now. So, and there was some controversy within that rule. The decision to protect only high quality owl habitat, for example, best science clearly showed that all owl habitat could have been protected by that rule. But instead, they felt like, that in a sense, a compromise was needed, and that they also promoted fire risk reduction in owl habitat. And since that time, we have not really seen, a big benefit there. Owls seem to be fairly well adapted to fire, and so this notion that we need to log to save the owl doesn't really bear out. And again, I think that we, in many cases, need to continue to protect the owl from logging due to fragmentation and other effects that come with it. So in 2020, science did finally catch up a little bit. The northern spotted owl was determined that it should be endangered. The agency did not go through with the listing. However, they determined it was warranted but precluded for action. So again, spotted owl protection deferred under the last administration. But what that does show is that it again makes the case that maybe we should think about protecting all quality owl habitat, which is basically everything about 80 years and older. That's about the age when owls start using forests. It's also when the carbon storage starts to significantly uptick. And so both for climate and biodiversity, 80 years is a good line to be thinking about. And so in the alternative, that a sign-on letter that we did and a bunch of groups endorsed to the administration asked that an alternative be included in the amendment that would do what we're recommending here. Protect all the stands that are 80 years and older. We think that that would have the maximum climate and biodiversity benefits. And then when we look at the problems in the current plan, I think one of the biggest loopholes was that it allowed for salvage logging in the reserves. And we unfortunately have seen some, I would say, unsustainable post-fire logging that's resulted as a result of that loophole. So closing that, limiting salvage logging to simply protection of human safety and not general landscape logging, I think would be a critical step forward. And then our friend, the marbled murrelet, we really need to think about more there for habitat conservation. And it's also in the murrelet zone that you get your biggest carbon benefits. These are the coastal forests. These tend to be, some of the biggest, potential areas for growth. And so we're recommending a doubling of the buffers for the murrelet. And then for the dry forest, we think that the guidelines that guide the reserve is actually the best way to handle the restoration and fuel reduction issues that people would like to do. So we think it offers the best combination of some allowance for activity while still maintaining some safeguard. So just real quick on the marbled murrelet, this is its range. You can see it inhabits all the way up to Alaska, but in the Pacific Northwest, it's listed as threatened in Washington, Oregon, and Northern California. And it's a really cool bird. It's a fishing bird. It goes to the near shore areas to hunt for fish, but then it flies inland and it nests in the tops of old growth trees. And in fact, it likes to be in big trees. It likes big trees with big wide branches that it can just lay its eggs right on the branches in the moss. They don't even build a nest. But then they leave their chicks there all day. And then they go forage. And so it's really important that they be able to hide, that these eggs and these fledgling chicks not be found. But unfortunately, one effect of fragmentation of the forest is that it's allowing deeper penetration of some of these ravens and jays that predate the nests. And we're now starting to see a number of studies showing this predation to being a limiting factor for recovering the marbled murrelet population. So we're trying to clean up the campgrounds, working on a campaign that can help naturally limit the ravens and jays. These are very popular coastal campgrounds, and this has been a very effective project to try to get the amount of trash down that can lower their populations over time. And then we do have a couple specific, murrelet recommendations, doubling the size of their buffers around their occupied nests. Right now, it's about a quarter mile from the nest. We think a half mile would be a much safer distance for them. And again, the carbon benefits would be really significant. And then just going back to our full package of recommendations, again, we would very much like to see this be done as an alternative in the upcoming amendment. I think the analysis would be extremely beneficial. I think, looking at the carbon mitigation benefits and keeping the focus on recovery of these listed birds and salmon is going to get us the best overall outcome. So happy to turn it over to Ryan.
Well, thank you very much. And I should mention to folks, I'm off camera because I'm having computer. I don't have a computer. It's in the shop. So I'm on my phone. But I just wanted to add that the Northwest Forest Plan covers at least 5.9 million acres of California, and specifically the Klamath, Mendocino, Shasta Trinity, and Six Rivers National Forests, and then also the Rogue River Siskiyou National Forest, which is mostly in Oregon and has, I think, 200,000 acres in California, in Siskiyou County, and maybe a tiny bit in Delmar. And then all, but I'm not entirely sure of how many acres is in California, just because the northern spotted owl has a bad habit of existing where 4 different national forests come together. It's a place called the Medicine Lake Highlands, and it's the easternmost extent of the northern spotted owl habitat in California. And so that too is covered by the Northwest Forest Plan Amendment. And I don't know how many acres that is. So it could be that over 6 million acres of national forest is covered in California by this very important amendment. And just to mention some of the CalWild goals, and those are some of our partners out of this process. We've had an effort now for quite some time to try to get good fire, quote unquote, good fire. Hopefully you know what that means. But the fire we should have been using all along over the last century, and that Native Americans were using for eons, and are using again now on many of these public lands, that we're trying to facilitate the return of good fire to these national forests, and we certainly hope that efforts to increase fire resilience aren't going to be used by the Forest Service as an excuse to log the big old and even mature trees. And so what CalWild hopes to get out of this is to save those big trees, but to focus the management for fire resilience elsewhere. There's a lot of young forest out there that was clear cut or otherwise logged in a very poor fashion. It's in a terrible condition from a fire resilience perspective. And, that's where we want to see the Forest Service, the state, and anyone else who wants to promote fire resilience. That's where we want to see them focus and stay out of these key old growth areas. And then lastly, one of the things that we want to do, CalWild wants to do, is bring some of these old growth heavy places to light, to public awareness, at least to the awareness of elected officials like Senator Padilla and others, so that we can give, personalities to this issue of protecting our last old growth, to personalize them. So we'd love to get your assistance, people on this call, in selecting some places around the state that represent old growth, as for the new old growth rule, but also for the Northwest Forest Plan, some really important places in the at least 5.9 million acres covered by the plan. And so, just to lend some, to make it real by talking about very real places on the ground and the people, who love those places. So I think that's all I'll add. So thank you.
And if I could jump back in here, thanks, Ryan. We did just see the Federal Advisory Committee vote on their recommendations, and they should be available soon. And then in terms of an actual draft amendment, I have heard as early as the end of July, end of this month, but more likely in August now. So it seems like the Forest Service has been basically working the whole time that the Federal Advisory Committee has been working, and we can probably expect to see something out fairly soon. So rallying a big public comment, I think, will be really helpful.
Well, I will mention the obvious, and the Forest Service was trying to get this done before the close of this year originally. I think that it's now unlikely that we'll be able to see an amendment process be completed before the end of the year. And why does that matter, right? Well, come November, we will have a presidential election. Steve touched on the differences between the Biden administration and the Obama administration, or administrations versus the Trump administration. I think that if we are at risk of having a one-term Biden administration, we, on one hand, want this to be a quick process. We would have wanted this to have been completed before the end of Biden's first term. Now that seems like that is probably unlikely to happen. So there is a risk that if this is a rulemaking process that is left open, that we could have a kind of a reversal of fortunes under maybe Trump 2.0 administration. There is also a number of new Supreme Court rulings, which I think could harm us here. This is a federal rulemaking that is going to occur. We just had Chevron overturned in Loper Bright. So we will have our federal courts, many of whom have been appointed by, federal court judges have been appointed by Donald Trump and other conservative administrations, now have to give less deference to the Forest Service in their construction of rules. We also have in Corner Post an ability for the Northwest Forest Plan, some of the core components to be challenged again because it got rid of the statute of limitations for APA challenges. So we are in a pretty nervous time, I would say, and I think that as environmentalists, we need to be aware of the political currents that are driving changes here. Ryan, looks like your hand is up.
Oh, yeah, I just wanted to add, many of you will be familiar with the Bureau of Land Management's INSIP process, Northwest California Integrated Resource Management Plan, or INSIP. And it's an update of the BLM's 1995 resource management plans for the Redding and Arcata field offices. And those field offices are also covered by the Northwest Forest Plan. Note that the Northwest Forest Plan was approved in 94, and then these Redding and Arcata plans were approved in 95. And so the BLM is on the cusp of approving this year revisions of that 1995 plan, and including the elements of it that are covered by the Northwest Forest Plan of 1994. And I just wanted to call people's attention to the fact that the plan basically conserves old growth, period. And I just encourage Tom and other experts, Steve, to look at how this INSIP plan, the BLM has announced that it's going to treat no one mentioned this, but the 1990 Northwest Forest Plan of 1994 established a network of reserves that aren't entirely ancient forests, but usually have big chunks of ancient forest in them. And they're called late successional reserves, or LSRs. And the Northwest Forest Plan revision won't, I understand, affect the establishment or existence of those LSRs, but it definitely would affect their management. And so in this new INSIP plan, the BLM, I thought, really had totally enlightened management. And I just, encourage people to check that plan out. It's an example of the kind of plan we wanted to get approved this year, so that it was in place. So thank you.
Thanks, Ryan. Do any of our panelists have anything else to add?
Well, back to my original thought, that the Northwest Forest Plan didn't happen in a vacuum. It happened because people rallied to protect the ancient forest, and I think that that's how this has to continue to play out, where the elected officials need to hear that this needs to be a high priority. President Clinton did an extraordinary plan that had overlaying layers of protection. And it's because of that it's stood the test of time, I think. And so we need similar, precautionary approach applied this time. And so I think, continuing to reach out to the administration and to elected officials in Congress is going to be essential.
Thank you. If that's all, Tom, do you have anything to add?
Well, I'm happy to talk about some other subjects too, because I think that we had some others on the roster of things to discuss if you want to go to those.
Yeah, absolutely.
So while the 94 plan was great, one area in which it perhaps fell short, or maybe rather, our politics have become more enlightened, is in areas of recognition of tribal management or co-management or tribal involvement in public lands management over areas of ancestral territory. This is a big focus of the Federal Advisory Committee, is how we can better support the integration of tribal concerns, tribal management. We can talk about in a lot of different ways into the Northwest Forest Plan. There are going to be a number of recommendations coming out of that Federal Advisory Committee. I think that this is an area in which Pacific Northwest environmental groups can and should be supportive. I think that broadening tribal co-management over federal public lands is likely to result in better land management decisions generally. And I think that this is also kind of a social justice need that we should be responsive to. So that's something that is positive in these forthcoming plan amendments, or likely positive in the forthcoming plan amendments. And we talked a lot about fire, given that this is kind of a California focus group, and I mentioned before some of the threats, and Steve talked about this as well. Fire is one of the big things in this amendment process. That's what the Forest Service directed the Federal Advisory Committee to consider. As Ryan said as well, we're unlikely to see changes to the geographic distribution or bounds of our reserve networks within the Northwest Forest Plan, but things are likely to change. Activities that are permissible are likely to change within those reserve networks, especially for dry forests. Dry forests being those that are this is going to sound dumb, that are drier, which are typical for the forests of Southern Oregon and Northern California. A lot of ours would fall under the kind of dry forest area. In particular, in these, the Forest Service appears very concerned that a lack of forest management could increase fire severity risk. I think that their concern perhaps is overblown, but it is what the Forest Service is acting on. And here we can see a pretty significant rollback of protections for these late successional forests. And that's a concern. Obviously, the draft is not out yet. We don't have alternatives out yet, so I can't say what is going to happen. But in looking at a crystal ball, my guess is that forest restoration treatments, so-called forest restoration treatments, will be allowed in late successional reserves in dry forest ecosystems. And we will have individual mature and old growth tree retention requirements. So if a tree is sufficiently large or old, that will be protected, but that will perhaps be it. And so I think that, in looking to the crystal ball, looking into the future, the Forest Service is going to spend a lot of energy and effort in creating driving projects that will implicate these late successional reserves. So this is an interesting moment. This is a concern as well. But I think that we'll wait to, yeah, and as Ryan says in chat, and avoid hard and fast rules. I think that the name of the game here is operational flexibility, increasing discretion to local offices to try to come up with plans that best meet kind of very specific local objectives. I think that that's where we are heading. Generally, if we were to zoom out on the Pacific Northwest as a whole, I think that we'll see a movement of commercial logging within our national forests away from those kind of murrelet forests that Steve was talking about, the coastal forests that are less fire prone, and significantly more logging, more commercial logging in dry forest ecosystems. And they will try to pair together commercial logging with fuels reduction work, if that makes sense. So, you know, that's what I foresee as the future of the Northwest Forest Plan.
Thanks, Tom. That was awesome. Steve, Brian, do you have any remaining thoughts?
Well, I'd say that's one possible outcome there. You know, I think the FAC voted to basically protect trees on the dry forest 150 years and older, and so it would appear to move to, you know, the individual tree retention standard that would guide things. And I know that there's a lot of debate about the prescriptions and a lot of support in a lot of places, but I think that what isn't being considered is the politics, the fact that these forests have been, you know, the target of raids in the past, and that when there's pressure for timber volume, you don't want to lower the bar to allow for unintended consequences. So I think that the challenge, of course, is how do you allow for what you want to see happen and prevent the things that you don't. Ryan.
Yeah, speaking of politics, I when I look at who's on the call, there are a lot of potential strong, well, existing, I should say, allies that you folks on the call are constituents of, such as Congressman Huffman, Congressman Mike Thompson. We're actively trying to get him up to snuff on the subject. He represents the Mendocino National Forest, and he's not as easy, let's say, as Congressman Huffman, but he's totally an ally on this. But we got to give them well, I should say, we need to suggest the talking points to them. And so we encourage all of you to, you know, be involved in this process, and and then, you know, let's not forget Senator Badilla, of course, and Senator Butler, whose staff attended the last was part of the Northwest Forest Plan meeting virtually, I noticed. So, and then there's many great local county supervisors that we can call upon too, and their gravitas to help influence this plan. And I would just encourage people to aim at let's have our old growth and our fire resilience too. And I think that there's going to be a huge desire to do something with chainsaws. And I think we need to point them to the young stuff, point them to the road network, things like that, and, you know, try to keep them out of our most precious ancient forest. And I think these politicians will get that. So I encourage you to help with that lobbying once we have some talking points developed.
Thanks, Ryan. If it's okay with folks, I think we have a question, and we could probably open it up to a little Q&A period here for the last 20 minutes. Brad?
Thanks. I have a comment and a question. I'm a climate physicist at Brown University, but the reason I'm on this call is that I do trail work on the Pacific Crest Trail and the Bigfoot Trail. And so I've seen the Forest Service in action a lot. And I think it's important, I want this group to be aware that with these trail work focused organizations, the Forest Service basically buys their compliance because they fund them. And in return, these organizations are not willing to speak up against practices that are harming the forest. So the Pacific Crest Trail Association received $1 million from the Forest Service last year to fund their volunteer trail work program. And it took, another climate scientist and I eventually got an article published in their magazine about climate change affecting the trail, but it took overwhelming effort to get that done. And so I just, you might think of these groups as natural allies, but I think, be wary of this funding from the Forest Service that's compromising their stance. So my question is, though, with the overturning of Chevron, I wonder if that's also an opportunity, though, to challenge the Forest Service, because, the courts previously had to defer to the agencies. They often would decide against environmental groups. Now, maybe there is an opportunity there to challenge some Forest Service decisions, like they're avoiding the use of NEPA and so on. So I wonder if the panelists have a thought about that.
Yeah, certainly, Brad. Chevron being overturned is a double-edged sword, but I would say that generally we are fans of an administrative state, of a robust administrative state, and that's so. There might be kind of new opportunities, new tools for us. I think that the greater harm is the weakening of deference to the various federal agencies that make life in the United States possible. I would also, maybe this is just pessimistic, I would think that Democratic appointed judges are kind of more institutionalist in their leaning, and are less likely to try to burn the thing down. And I see a lot of that in a lot of these Trump appointed judges where they're almost accelerationists, right? They're trying to achieve some sort of Heritage Foundation vision of an extremely limited federal government, and they're willing to do kind of crazy things like ban mifepristone. So yes, Chevron being overturned does offer opportunities, but I think I'm more scared of the consequence of it than excited for those opportunities.
Thanks, Tom. Before I hop to Dan real quick, I'm just going to read a question from Kimberly. This is for Steve. So as Tom alluded to from the FAC recommendations, are there specific standards you see as being the most problematic, aka the most threatening to mature old growth forest stands? And I can re-put that question in the chat. So
I think, and anything that would weaken protections for mature old forests could be a risk because of the logging pressure that the Forest Service has been subjected to. But there's also a number of wildlife protections embedded within the plan for spotted owls, that get at the age of allowed logging. And I guess I'm just concerned that when the FAC was having their discussions, they weren't really factoring in the owl and the owl's needs. And they also weren't factoring in carbon. And so I think that, in some cases, maybe allows them to support a higher age of logging than you would pick if you were focused on climate mitigation and ESA recovery. So again, I think the age of logging, whether it's the 150-year limit or an 80-year limit, might actually be a pretty big difference.
So something that came out of the fact that I was fairly concerned with, again, in this breakdown of wet versus dry, is in dry forest, they were coming up with, I think, relatively subjective amounts that they want to see the Forest Service treat. And it would be, some people would throw out, well, I want to see a third of all dry forests treated. I want to see 2/3. And so I think that that's kind of a direction that I'm concerned with, which is not perhaps not locally attuned or kind of a broad prescription that is that doesn't take into account kind of on the ground realities that will force the Forest Service or the Forest Service will cite to that as justification for doing a lot more. Is, well, we were directed to treat 2/3 of forest, so therefore we're going to go into this NSO activity center.
Thanks, Tom. Dan, you had your hand up.
Yeah, thank you. First a comment and then a couple questions. The comment is, I understand the need to find some common ground, and the age of trees is an important one for certain parts of the environment, but ecologically, it's not a very sustainable goal. And having been a monitor for federal conservation easements that were based on tree size, not age, pretty much every single tree that is below that age or that size will be cleared out. And then you don't have the regeneration of the forest that you need in order to have those 80 to 120-year-old trees in the future. So just a cautionary tale there. But the questions, two questions, and Ryan mentioned the BLM's planning process. I want to say NSIP, but that's probably wrong. Now, my question is just whether or not that is there a way for messaging to combine what the BLM has done on their lands with that planning as an encouragement in the amendment for talking points or our messaging for the Forest Service to use? And the second question is, I'm assuming there's some robust science that's going to be showing that these amendments have problems. And do you see that those voices for science playing a positive role right now, or can they play a better role? Are they being silenced? And we know that'll change if there's a change in the administration with the next election. So two questions, the BLM process as it marries with messaging for the Forest Service, and also how robust is the science messaging? Thanks. I guess that's for Ryan and Steve, maybe. I'm just sorry, I didn't say who.
I'll quickly address the BLM one. Sorry, Nicole, I just saw your note. Nicole would like a link for the Chevron ruling. Could someone share that, like one of you lawyers? Thank you very much. And hello, Nicole. And then, the NSIP process, we are seeing if what it does for late successional reserves is what we would like to see the Mendocino National Forest nearby do. And if it is, then we would, and that's why I want Tom and others to look at NSIP if they might. And what I'd like us to do is suggest that model to Congressman Thompson and Congressman Huffman, who represent the Mendocino, and say, this is what the BLM did just 2 miles to the west. Let's make this like the minimum that the Forest Service should do. And the only difference is that the old growth reserves that the Forest Service has do have some places that were logged inside of them, while the BLM ones are actually pure old growth. And so I'm thinking of offering them as a model, but I want people to agree with me first. So thank you for mentioning that.
Thanks, Ryan. And back on the science question, I'd say the fire debate is a very difficult one. There's a range of opinions there, and then there's different emphasis where some people are really focused on home protection as their issue, and so that might lead to a slightly different answer if you're just looking at the general forest ecosystem question. So I don't necessarily feel like the fire science is going to help us. If anything, it's been sort of running against us, because you have a lot of scientists who are ringing alarm bells saying that we need to go out and do a bunch of active treatments of different kinds. So I think that's a challenging part. On the climate side, I think that we are seeing some very significant help. in terms of recognition of the regrowth of the forests and the change of the carbon flows by not cutting old forests. So I think that part is looking solid, and and back to the original outline of a possible gains for some forests and higher risk for others. I think that's sort of the outline that seems to be before us. And so for me, the challenge is can we make sure that we maintain adequate wildlife considerations? We still have spotted owls over on the dry forests, and the spotted owl situation is rather dire because of the barred owl invasion. And so we need to really think about doing more rather than doing the minimum.
Thanks, Steve. And thank you to all our panelists. Does anyone have any further questions or comments?
I saw that Susie had a question in the comments, which was about the composition of the Federal Advisory Committee, seeming pro-timber biased. I think that's true. They, in theory, attempted to create kind of a balanced Federal Advisory Committee, as is required by the Federal Advisory Committee Act for the Northwest Forest Plan. But I think that the folks that they chose as representatives from the Enviro side are generally folks who are more sympathetic to dry forest logging. So the Forest Service, created the Federal Advisory Committee, I think with the intent of having kind of certain recommendations flow from it. So I believe that the preferred alternative or something close to it will be largely reflective of the recommendations of the Federal Advisory Committee.
Thank you, Tom. Sam?
Hey, all. Many thanks to the presenters here. Really nice work. It's my understanding that the aquatic resources conservation component of the Northwest Forest Plan is largely not going to be tinkered with much. Just wondering if any of you have anything more or less to say about that.
I think that's right. I don't believe that was included in the list of issues. And then in regard to the other wildlife issues that we basically heard, it was going to be left to Fish and Wildlife Service consultation to determine if any of the proposed changes would be acceptable for owls, murrelets, and salmon, I would assume.
Excellent. Thank you, Steve.
I just wanted to repeat that, and also to say that even the Forest Service staff who wanted to see some amendments say it ain't going to happen because Steve kind of hinted at this. If they reopen too many issues, it's going to require consultation. So with the Fish and Wildlife Service.
Thank you. Brad?
Ryan made a comment that I thought was really interesting, which is BLM seems to be more progressive about these things now than the Forest Service. We used to think of the BLM as the Bureau of Livestock and Mining, but there seems to have been this change. And I was wondering if the panelists could comment on what's happening politically. Is it just because BLM is an interior that they have a more broader view of the environment?
I think that Ryan is in particular talking about Northern California BLM, which is, we have some great local offices which have been somewhat removed from kind of the pressure from Washington, or I guess they're not Washington anymore, right? And so our local office is the outlier here in Arcata. They do a great job. I think in part because these are not commercial timber producing lands. If we go over the border into Oregon, our friends at Cascadia Wildlands and Klamath-Siskiyou Wildlands Center would say that the BLM is really aggressive in attempting to log old growth.
Yeah, just real quick, I just want to add on that in the late 1980s, the same BLMer who thought that perhaps it should be BLM that should take on responsibility for the Headwaters Forest Preserve is also the same one who decided that California BLM should not be about Bureau of Livestock and Mining and instead should be at a minimum about recreation. And I've been told since that time that California BLM, I've been told by everybody in every other state I've ever that has BLM lands, that California BLM is freakishly good. And they're shocked at what I have to say about California BLM. As Andre said in chat, that most of the state's pretty darn good compared to every other state. And then of that, the two best offices are Redding and Arcata. Okay. So they're just amazing. And even the plan from 95 that they're revising was really great for the time. So INSIP is definitely historically good. And I should just say, you all know about 30 by 30. So it is the first federal management plan in California to reference 30 by 30 as a goal. Okay. And it even gives the stats on like how much it's advancing 30 by 30. So it's really awesome. And that's why you may see in the media in the coming weeks us getting, people like Mendocino County Supervisor John Hascheck saying great things. And State Senator Mark McGuire saying great things about the plan, because we want the plan to be more difficult to overturn next year if things go bad.
That sounds great, Ryan. I've been interested in there being a public lands component to 30 by 30, and I'm hoping in a second term we'll see something large.
I like how optimistic you are that there will be a second term.
Well, I was going to mention about BLM. The BLM did leave the Northwest Forest Plan in 2016. And one of the things that they did is they did protect the old growth more. And so that the old growth in the matrix did see some protection, but some of the mature forests have been remaining unprotected. And so I would actually argue the BLM plan in Oregon could go further and should be consistent with what the Forest Service does, so that we have return to a range-wide plan.
Yeah, well, there's a good example, folks. That Oregon, I believe, and correct me if I'm wrong, I believe most of the old growth on BLM in Oregon are on what are called Oregon and California lands, which are and they are, I understand, terribly managed, just terribly. And so that's just an example of compare that to Arcata and Redding.
Thanks, everyone. Are there any additional comments or questions as we wrap up today's panel? I see Dan put in the chat, caution about relying on consultation with U.S. Fish and Wildlife Service for protection. That requirement came close to being removed about 10 years ago, but federal scientists said no, but that can change. Just a note. All right, thank you so much to all of our panelists and everybody who came here today. I'll send out a recording to everybody who registered for the panel, so you can all share with your friends. Thank you, everyone.
Thank you. Bye.
Bye.
Thank you.